The discovery of personal whiteness among the world's people is a very modern thing. A 19th and 20th century matter indeed. The ancient world would have laughed at such a distinction. W.e.b. Du Bois. How do I start this? Put a finger down. You've ever made a video on black identity and code switching in which you cited a guy who inadvertently supported a eugenicist narrative on black identity? Yeah, so that's how my weekend's going. My video is like a random pill a hippie gives you at a festival. You don't know what you're in for. An enlightening journey of self-realization or a dip into the abyss. Or both, who knows. Either way, you'll want wine. In the 1930s, Franklin Frazier wrote some of the most notable work on black identity, and we've cited him before. His book is right next to me right here. Now, I'm gonna be honest. I didn't know much about his background, but in researching this video, I found some troubling things about him. We'll get back to him. But in the 1940s, Dr. Kenneth and Mamie Clark created what is called the doll test. If you're unfamiliar with these tests, basically the results showed that African-American children, when asked to pick a doll between a nice doll, a doll that looks like you, a doll that is... The questions were here. I don't remember the questions. But anyway, the children showed a preference for the white dolls over the black dolls. But the important part there is it was crucial to the Brown versus Board case. What if I told you that even though all these people were trying to get away from the eugenicist narrative, they inadvertently ended up supporting it? Sounds weird, right? But this video is going to tell you why maybe it isn't. We'll begin this journey with me talking about myself because it's relevant and it's what I'm best at. So I graduated college and it was meh. I did everything socially awkward high school me dreamed of. I say as though I am no longer socially awkward. Parties, alcohol, meaningless sex and flings, being extremely critical of BLM, defending BLM to white people. These are all normal college experiences, right? No, but what made this experience memorable was looking at the person who came into the university and looking at the person who left the university and being like, what the fuck? Boy, oh boy, let me tell you, two different niggas. What I came to learn is what I thought was just me maturing and becoming a, cooler person was actually called Nigrescence, or becoming woke. So I thought it'd be interesting to discuss, how this term came about and what previous studies on black identity like the doll test and Frazier's analysis left out, and also what they implied. If you're familiar with my content, you can think of this as a conclusion/expansion of the code switching video. And if you're new here, then you can think of this as a brief history on black identity. Okay, maybe brief isn't the best word. Look, I don't know what happened. For some reason when writing this, it didn't feel valid until the script was over 100 pages. Why do I do this to myself? Anyway, part 1, Caucasians and Eugenics. If you were a colonist, you knew that your technology was superior to the Indians. You knew that you were civilized and they were savages. It was evident in your firearms, your clothing, your housing, your government, your religion. The Indians were supposed to be overcome with admiration and to join you in extracting riches from the country. But your superior technology had proved insufficient to extract anything. The Indians, keeping to themselves, laughed at your superior methods and lived from the land more abundantly and with less labor than you did. To be thus condescended to by the heathen savages was intolerable. And when your own people started deserting in order to live with them, it was too much. So you killed the Indians, tortured them, burned their villages, burned their cornfields. It proved your superiority. So before getting into Nigrescence and wokeness, we're going to talk about why the model was developed. It was in large part developed to counter the narratives of self-loathing and self-hate surrounding black identity. It came about after a long history of eugenics, and we're still kind of fighting with it actually, but we'll get to that. But anyway, you see, previously and still today, the goal being to convince people that the underdeveloped deserved their lot because it was because of their own culture, or they were just simply not human or not human enough to sustain their own societies. So we all can see now, some of us can see now that this is all due to socioeconomics and there's no biological reason for racial inequality. But part of what made it so hard to see back then was that this biological argument was being touted by some of the most wokest people of the time, some of which you might be surprised by. In the myth of race, a lot of these biological arguments are debunked and deconstructed, while also giving us a little bit of a history of how they came about. We'll be referencing this a lot for this part. We'll also be referencing the History of White People by Neil Irvin Painter, and a few others, but as you know, sources in the description. But if you aren't aware, there aren't any biological reasons for the inequalities of race, and God help you if you don't know that. If you take away nothing from this session, remember this. In 1950, UNESCO issued a statement asserting that humans belong to the same species and that race is not a biological reality but a myth. This was a summary of the findings of an international panel of anthropologists, geneticists, sociologists, and psychologists. The scientists involved were those who were conducting research and were the most knowledgeable about the topic of human variation. Today, the vast majority of those involved in the research on human variation would agree that biological races do not exist among humans. Among those who study the subject, who use and accept modern scientific techniques and logic, this scientific fact is as valid and as true as the fact that the earth is round and it revolves around the sun. But you already know that, right? But where'd it come from? And how are the Clarks and Frazier related to it? Well, let's start with how eugenics came about. In what is called antiquity, basically the Middle Ages, there was no concept of white people or white as a race. I'm not saying people with light skin didn't exist, they definitely did, but no one called them white, and nor was white a signifier of anything. Skin color had no strong significance of character. Identity in Greece was more tied to tribal names, like being Greek, or being Scythian or Celt, or being a Gaul or Germani. They were vague and Slavic notions of people in what is now Europe. Scythian meant little-known northeastern illiterate Stone Age people, and Celt denoted hidden, strange, painted people and barbarians to the west. We don't know what these people called themselves since the Greek name stuck, and what made a Celt, a Gaul, and a German was ambiguous. The Roman philosopher Posidonius of Rhodes bestowed the name Germani on all the northwestern barbaric tribes out of Roman control, as the Roman scholarship was replacing the Greek. When trying to define who these people are and looking for their origins, historians often run into a roadblock of people who never identified themselves as such. Social intercourse did not give rise among the Greeks and the Romans to the color prejudice of certain later Western societies. The Greeks and the Romans developed no doctrines of white superiority unsupported by facts or theological justifications for the color bar. The presence of large numbers of Negroes in a white society, according to some modern views, gives rise to anti-Negro feelings. Ethiopians were far from rare sights in Greco-Roman, particularly the Roman world. Yet, intense color prejudice of the modern world was lacking. Although it is impossible to estimate the Negro element in the classical world in terms of precise statistics, it is obvious that the black population in Greece and Italy was larger than has been generally realized. So if it wasn't there, then where was it? Well, fast forward a bit and we're at the Spanish Inquisition. The motivation behind the Inquisition was to make sure Jewish people were kept out of participating in mainstream society. While this totally rational animosity was mainly directed at Jewish people, when it moved to Rome in the 16th century, when it was still beefing with Jewish people, it expanded to include gays, Protestants, people accused of witchcraft, free thinkers, public intellectuals, and people considered to be quirky. How do you even define that? What did that mean back then? The Inquisition discriminated against and separated one group from another without allowing any legal means for discriminated groups to assimilate. Unlike earlier ones, the Spanish Inquisition did not focus on religion alone, but expanded to include race or ethnicity, introducing the notion of purity of blood. It was by classes of people rather than just categories of belief, Cullen Murphy notes. Furthermore, it was run by those in political power. Although these discriminating practices started as a result of conditions that were political or economic, scientific theories started to appear to justify the mistreatment of these groups. And after the discovery of America, these scientific notions were used to discriminate against the Native Americans, black people, and, well, just about anyone who wasn't considered white. Columbus's voyage to America was at the height of the Inquisition and was also funded mainly by Jewish people who converted to Christianity and feared prosecution. These were called conversos. Now they're right that the initial cause of this anti-Semitism in Portugal and Spain may have been caused by jealousy of the Jewish people who had a lot of wealth and power at the time. However, it also could be explained by them believing that Jewish people killed Jesus, so therefore they should kill them. I don't know. God has the weirdest fucking fandom. But when the Spaniards and Portuguese began to colonize America, the people's lands they were conquering had no established role in European society, so they gave them one. And new theories had to be formed to explain their places in the universe. Now, this is where the important part comes. These two theories to explain their places of the universe fell into two different camps, and these are the Pre-Adamite and the Degenerate theories. Now, the Pre-Adamite theory basically argues that Native Americans were here before humans, are a different species of human, and they aren't of God's creation. That one eventually got left on the back burner. The conquistadors justified their mistreatment of Native Americans by claiming they were subhuman and incapable of having abstract ideas and running their own world, despite them doing so just fine before they arrived, but I digress. They were also deemed incapable of morality and unable to become Christian. In 1512, Montesinos, a preacher in Santo Domingo, opposed the mistreatment of the Indians and insisted that they were human. Bartholomew de las Casas, oh my god, there are a lot of words here I have never pronounced in my life, please bear with me. Bartholomew de las Casas, who became a bishop of Chiapas, became an advocate of this cause and debated Sepulveda and his followers for almost half a century. Sepulveda being one of the main proponents of this pre-Adamite theory. If we talked about all the shit that led up to it, we'll be here all fucking day, just bear with me. He claimed that all people in the world are men. All have an understanding and volition, all take satisfaction in goodness, and feel pleasure with happy and delicious things, all regret and abhor evil. The first professor of philosophy in the New World, Alonso de Lavara Cruz, argued in his first and only course in the University of Mexico that Spaniards did not have the right to subjugate the Indians, and Pope Paul III in 1537 declared that the Indians are truly men and that they are not only capable of understanding the Catholic faith, but according to our information, they desire exceedingly to receive it. Even though the Spanish government and church eventually declared that indigenous people were human, shocker, Veracruz was still removed and sent to the Lower Yucatan, and the mistreatment of indigenous people did not subside. As the inhumane conquest of America continued, racial theories remained crucial in justifying the treatment of the local peoples, and a bit later the enslavement of Africans, who were often needed to replace the rapidly dying indigenous Americans as a workforce for exploiting the New World. The early Spanish debate was only a preview of the things to come. The two main theories, as I said, fell into the Pre-Adamite and the Degenerate theories. And these Pre-Adamite and Degenerate theories were later adopted by the English, Anglo-Americans, and the French in the 17th and 18th centuries. These theories then provided the basis of racist thought in regard to people of color and Jews for the 19th and 20th centuries. The author also argues that the threads of these two theories survived Darwinian times in the modern synthesis of evolutionary theory. Now, while the Pre-Adamite theory was eventually discarded by most people, the Degenerate theory ended up becoming a little more popular. And the Degenerate theory basically argued that all humans were created by God, beginning with Adam and Eve, but non-whites were thought to be inferior and needed guidance and control of rational men, which back then meant European Christians. The most moral people of their time, I'm sure. See, back then, challenging the biblical explanation of the origins of humans was not the vibes, so people usually used the generation theory. Their condition was assumed to be caused by some degenerative process, such as climate, conditions of life, isolation from Christian civilization, or some divine actions explained in the Bible. And this was the more liberal viewpoint, actually, since a lot of people who believe this theory still believe that the degenerate races could be regenerated by, helping them assimilate into European culture and being civilized. And in time, some of the most well-known proponents of this theory were John Locke and the wokest boy of all time, Immanuel Kant. To Kant, color was evidence of unchanging and unchangeable moral quality. He thought white Europeans have the necessary talent to be morally self-educating. Asians had some ability to do so, but lacked the ability to develop abstract concepts. And Africans can only be educated to follow orders and must be kept in order with a bamboo stick. And then he goes on to explain how to properly beat a slave. He also thought the indigenous people were hopeless and couldn't be educated at all, and that mixing races should be avoided because it causes misfortune and damage. So Kant was a champion of civil rights and equality of men for all, but he only wanted this for white people, basically. As Nita Jablonski states, through his writings and lectures, Kant successfully instilled some of the most trenchant and potent classifications of humanity into the minds of inexperienced and unsophisticated readers and students. He became one of the most influential racists of all times, and his racial philosophy was passed on for centuries. Since Kant is thought of as the most important moral theorist of modern times, his theories on race have been essentially ignored in discussions of the history of racism. As Charles W. Mills summarized, the embarrassing fact for the white West is that their most important moral theorist for the past 300 years is also the foundational theorist in the modern period of division between the persons and subpersons upon which Nazi theory will later draw. So modern moral theory and modern racial theory basically have the same daddy. So that's cool. Now, to be charitable to Kant, the idea of race at the time was dominated by white supremacy, being built off the Inquisition. And part of their lies were, as I said earlier, the scientific justification for race. But in this scientific endeavor to legitimize race and developing the idea of Caucasian, they ran into several hiccups, but that never stopped them. Even the term Caucasian still and isn't scientific in any way. Johann Blumenbach made the term after visiting the region of the Caucasus Mountains between the Caspian and Black Seas, and he decided its inhabitants the most beautiful of the world, the ideal type of humans created in God's image, and he deemed this area the likely site of where humans originated. Humans came from Africa. He also decided that all light-skinned peoples from this region, along with the Europeans, belonged to the same race, which he labeled Caucasian. Blumenbach named 4 other races that he considered physically and morally degenerate forms of God's creation. Blumenbach's system of racial classification was adopted by the United States, and scientists tried to prove that white people had bigger brains and were better than other races. Now, was this done by any scientific means on Blumenbach's part, or the scientist's part? Well, no. This was done purely on his aesthetic beliefs. And even though he expressed difficulty drawing the lines between human variation, he still accepted the underlying paradigm of the day that one creation was better than the other, and that one human race was more closer to God's creation than the other, with of course, black people being placed on the bottom. Which is kind of ironic because Blumenbach was among the least racist of the Enlightenment scholars. He had a library in his home devoted to the writings of black authors. He campaigned for the abolition of slavery, which was, as you probably can guess, wasn't very popular in his time. and he also asserted the moral superiority of slaves to their captors. Though, in the end, he still ended up with a racial classification system with white people on the top. Anyway, as such, the myth of African inferiority persisted. Ignore the change of positioning. My phone died, so I had to charge it and set back up. Unless you didn't notice the change of positioning, then pretend I never said anything. In the summer of 1856, the pro-slavery apologist argument can be summarized by this anonymous writer in this news article. The most minute and most careful researchers have as yet failed to discover the history or any knowledge of ancient times among the Negro races. They have invented no writings, not even a rude picture or writings of the lowest tribes. They have no gods, no heroes, no epic poem, and no legend. There never existed among them an organized government. There never ruled a hierarchy or established church. Might alone is right. They have never known the arts. They're ignorant, even of agriculture. The cities of Africa are vast accumulations of huts and hovels. Clay walls and thorny hedges surrounded them, and pools of blood and rows of skulls adorn their best houses. The few evidences in splendor or civilization are borrowed from Europe, where there is a religion or a creed. It is all that of the foreigners. All knowledge, all custom, all progress has come from them abroad. The Negro has no history. He makes no history. And this anonymous writer's rant about how black people don't have history was a dominant opinion justifying racial oppression in the United States. A result of the 300 years of systemic and African slavery in the New World, it was both an absolute imperative as a cornerstone for the rationalization of a slave society and a logical development of a broken civilization served so long by racial orders. By the middle of the 19th century, Western civilization, both at the strata intellectual and the scientific thought and that of popular opinion and mythology, had effectively sealed African past. The undercurrent that gave some recognition to the Africans and the black slaves' humanity, and that had been used to nurture much of the early anti-slave sentiment in literature, had been overwhelmed by the more constant and morally profound tradition of racism. This denial of Africa's social order in history was not simply a question of Europe or colonial America's ignorance of Africa. It merely served to extend the terms of rationales for fantasy and racial inferiority for Jews, Irish, Slavs, Asians, as well as for black people. Even the shift in the 18th and 19th century Western thought from the basis of religion to philosophical epistemology to that of modern science had made little difference. Brian Street, in his reconstruction of the history of the relationship between scientific thought and racial theories that wove through the English literature of the Victorian period, concludes that the link between race and culture, physical and mental qualities having been established, any subjective feelings with regard to the character of other races can be given scientific backing. If the criteria for distinguishing between races of men depended on such subjective considerations, Voltaire and Rousseau could claim that Negroes were naturally inferior to Europeans in mental ability, and Hume, there was never a civilized nation among any complexion other than white. With as much justification as Blumenbach could claim that Caucasian was the most beautiful, chauvinism was rendered in scientific terms in the late 19th century. With the American bourgeois achieving its first stages of ideological coherence, this intellectual grounding came to absorb the past of those peopling America, past and present. The result was a construction of legends upon which the Republic rested. The hard class divisions rooted in European socioeconomics were obscured by a new racial mythology. The existence of land-rich elites, the social and political prerogatives of the mercantile capital and Arganian property, even the genesis of Southern American aristocracy, all of this was inundated by paeans to the political enlightenment that, culling from Europe the best of its moral traditions, had presumably conducted the people to independence, constructed a near-perfect instruments of governance, and provided the individual rights guaranteed by formal legal codes. Even the long, passionate, and sometimes violent opposition of American democracy to social democracy or quote-unquote mob rule was faded and forgotten in the wake of an emergent racial consensus. While reviewing these beginnings, Edmund Morgan, reconstructing the relations of early Virginian colonists with native peoples, summarized the collective psyche state that you must have felt accompanied by the cycle of atrocities that would have extended ultimately into the present century. If you were a colonist, you knew that your technology was superior to the Indians. You knew that you were civilized and they were savages. The U.S. legal system would later draw on Blumenbach's system of racial categorization to decide who was naturally white. And this happened in the 1970 Naturalization Act. In 1923, however, the Supreme Court rejected the naturalization petition of an immigrant from North India, saying he was Caucasian but not white, citing among many things his skin color. So this constant tweaking of the white race is, evidence that it's obviously a social thing, but you know that, right? You know that, right? The North American system of racial classification continues to shift in response to historical, economic, and political events. Yet the basic conceptual framework, imagining biological distinct racial categories, remains surprisingly stable. Which is weird because most other labels have changed. Caucasian has very biological undertones, unlike other terms which imply more of a culture. I mean, no one can tell you what Caucasian culture is, and most people probably couldn't find the Caucasus on a map. I mean, I know damn well I can't. Using Caucasian also erases the past of the person we were speaking of. African American, Asian American, Hispanic American, Caucasian. Linguistically speaking, when you add like the hyphenated status to a word, it implies that the hyphenated word is, not the norm. This collapse of many European identities into the label of Caucasian also provides a good cover for crime statistics. No one could point to the crime rates of the Italians or Polish or, anybody else because they were now part of this ever-expanding category of white. But they could point to the black crime statistics, which Frazier really liked to do. Anyway, going back to eugenics, the narrative of eugenics wasn't only present in Western science, but also African psychology as well. AP theory offers a worldview that proclaims holistic orientation, where the spiritual and material are inseparable. The materialism and science of the West are said to fundamentally taint the humanity of white people, making them crave control and domination over others. Mass murder, genocide, and slavery are seen as natural outcomes of the worldview primarily driven by materialism and unrestrained greed. AP theory then does an about-face and embraces one of the most discredited forms of Western science. Rather than turning to IQ tests, AP theory turns to studies of the role of melanin in human biology and human behavior. And this is how AP theory started to look a lot like eugenics by devaluing others of the outside group, such as white people or queer people. This, combined with other issues, prevented AP theory from gaining acceptance within black academic circles. Though it should be noted that this has changed, and now members of the LGBTQ community are openly able to serve on African psychology boards. So why did I tell you this? Well, it was to give you an idea of how pervasive this narrative was. So eventually the biological arguments justifying racial oppression started to lose credibility. So we thought. And a major blow to this was a doll study done by the Clarks. Critique of the Clarks racial preference study, which had been conducted in 1939, was delayed in large measure because the findings from the study became part of the legal rationale used in the Supreme Court in the construction of its 1954 decision declaring school segregation unconstitutional. So to criticize this study was almost to criticize the court's decision. So obviously not many people spoke up. However, after some time, William Cross and other people started to develop their own ideas of black identity to challenge this doll study. Their mindset wasn't necessarily to dismiss previous findings, but to show that previous studies depicting black people as racially self-hating and self-loathing had gone too far. In 1976, W. Curtis Banks started the research community with a reanalysis of a cluster of racial preference studies, showing that, statistically speaking, black children's doll choices fit a pattern of randomness or chance behavior. However, rather than the random behavior, another interpretation for the split choice pattern is a performance of biculturalism, wherein the children are wanting to display favorable attitudes towards both preferences. That black children are socialized to become biculturally oriented, and white children more monoculturally oriented, was the focus explored in the study of black, white, and white ethnic families, guided by the theoretical writings of Jürgen Boffenbrenner on the ecology of human development. The study of black and white families incorporated an identity component designed to reveal the racial cultural messaging embedded in the ecology of everyday mother-child interactions and activities. The results showed that white mothers presenting the world in monoracial terms and using this information to predict racial preference, white children would be expected to evidence a monoracial white doll preference pattern. Turning to the results for black families, 21% of the activities described by the black mothers had, on average, a black cultural emphasis, and 79% a white general American undertone. The split cultural pattern was all more evident within a doll human figure count. Typically, 40% of the dolls found in black homes were black and 60% white. Regardless of the activity in question, the person or persons participating in the activity with the children were black 90 to 95% of the time. Thus, some variant of a black perspective was operating in the ecological presentation of the word to the child. Black children raised in such a fashion can be expected to display an attraction to both black and white dolls in the context of the racial preference study. This resulting split is better understood as an evolving bicultural frame rather than a confused or random behavior. In addition, those ugly doll comments talked about in the doll study are often transformed over the progression of the black child's life. Anyway, this research shows that clearly in the search for blackness, there is something more than simply finding a white doll more pretty than a black doll. Cross thinks that racial preference and psychoanalytic studies such as the mark of oppression are pillars of a more comprehensive theory known as the deficit perspective on black culture, the origin of which can be traced back to Frazier's seminal work on a black family published in 1939. Frazier constructed a deficit perspective based on a must-be hypothesis. Frazier's frame of reference about black people was heavily influenced by none other than Robert Urza Park, who worked for Booker T. Washington for 9 years, so he was super woke, right? Well, no. Ezra Park thought that Africans were biologically inferior, and that whatever human capacity they possessed in Africa was destroyed during slavery, and that ex-slaves were illiterate, destitute, and poor, but also damaged in ways that were hard to define. This added factor was theorized by Frazier. Frazier basically argued that cultural distortions must be accounted for in talking about black poverty. In fact, he argued that cultural distortions must be accounted for in addition to any damage to black people linked to social class. Thus, in studying black people or the poor urban middle class, one might be able to isolate socioeconomic dynamics. However, in the final analysis, the negative effects of slavery must be added to the equation. This added factor unique to black people, this legacy of slavery, if you will, made black poverty different. This presumed added factor helped to essentialize the discourse on blackness in many ways that made it possible to put black inferiority on the table, while at the same time allowing one to declare oneself not a racist while pointing out this legacy. This emphasis on slavery and the degeneracy of black people led to a victim blame type analysis, which made invisible the role of systemic racism, which was the actual issue. Over time, this added feature came to be known as the deficit perspective on black life. The assumption that slavery left a mark on the soul of black people is a pillar in the work of Frazier, the Moynihan report on black families, the mark of oppression, and the logic behind racial preference studies, and a cornerstone of the narrative of post-traumatic slave syndrome by Joy Degray. Cross states that he's lost track of the number of times black graduate students have started theses where the point of departure is this assumption that slavery left black people psychologically damaged, that there must be something wrong with black people. This is called the must-be hypothesis.
Here's a quotation, for example, from a recent article by William Ryan, a Harvard psychologist who criticizes your report in The Nation, and this is what he writes. The implicit point is that Negroes tolerate promiscuity, illegitimacy, one-parent families, welfare dependency, and everything else that is supposed to follow. Now, that's the criticism he makes of your report. Now, how do you answer those charges?
I'm not responsible for the fact that he can't read. As E. Franklin Frazier said, and I quoted from him at some length, there is a lot of evidence that the Negro middle-class family, when it gets its opportunity, gets a bearing, is, if anything, more stern, more rigid than most. But the evidence is simply clear. Negro Americans live like any other Americans, and when they're forced into the ghetto and forced into disorganization, they have no more better protections than anyone else.
I'd like to ask you one specific question, which the New York Times quotes you today as saying. You say that 44% of the children in Harlem are illegitimate. Now, how do you know that?
Those are statistics in the New York City Department of Health, sir. 10 health districts in central Harlem, the area which the great American sociologist Kenneth Clark described in his HARU report as having undergone a massive deterioration of the fabric of society and its institutions, and right under our prosperous noses that happened. That hasn't existed for 50 years. That's happened in the last 15 years in this America. And we've been sitting around thinking things have been getting better, and they haven't been getting better for those children.
Mr. Moynihan, in your report you say, quote, equality of opportunity almost ensures inequality of results, unquote. Are you proposing preferential treatment on the hiring of Negroes?
I believe this country owes the American Negro his back wages, yes.
Should the federal government support preferential treatment for Negroes, then?
I believe what President Johnson said in his Howard University speech. You cannot keep a man in chains for 3 centuries, then take the chains off and say suddenly, okay, you're free to run the race of life with anybody else.
So when chasing down the origins of this deficit perspective, try saying that 3 times fast. When chasing down the origins of this perspective, we find W.e.b. Du Bois, Franklin Frazier, and a school of sociology at Chicago. Franklin Frazier's work pretty much legitimized the negative legacy of slavery tropes. This negative legacy of slavery trope finds relevance today in like the post-traumatic stress disorder or Joel Remsen's work. In a production of Frazier's 1932 dissertation, which was actually published as a book later on, it was titled Le Bourgeois Noir, which is the black bourgeois in French. Yeah, that's right, we took French. I made it deep. Even though it's 2 black bourgeois, the essay shares little resemblance to the book. In Frazier's dissertation, he references parts of Du Bois's work, but only the parts that agree with his dissertation, basically. Frazier claimed that slavery left black people embracing an extremely primitive, deeply flawed culture, combined to produce disastrous social results such as youth delinquency, unhinged sexual behavior, broken marriages, and out-of-wedlock births. And I'm going to tell you why all this is bullshit. The Chicago School of Sociologists cut their teeth tracking the adjustment of ethnic groups, such as the Irish, Italians, and Eastern European Jews. Each of these groups entered the United States with an inferior cultural foundation, and their challenge was to become assimilated. Viewed from the perspective of eugenics, these were inferior groups, with black people positioned at the base of either cultural or racial hierarchies. Ezra Park and his associates suggested that otherwise inferior groups can learn to mimic or imitate aspects of new culture, but complete assimilation, a long and word I don't know how to pronounce process, was fundamentally impossible for members of groups that were genetically inferior from the beginning. So that's kind of yikes, and even more yikes was people who had these ideas made up the dissertation committee that, gave Frazier his degree. So I was thinking maybe Frazier employed these tropes just to get his degree or whatever, because, never did eugenics, but I've been there. But he had all the time to come back and correct this, but he never did, and he still claimed ownership over it afterwards. In the absence of any recorded modification, then Assistant Secretary of Labor and future Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, drew a straight line between his observation of broken family statistics and Frazier's depiction of broken family dynamics recorded in 1939. Frazier totally discounts the idea of black people being able to achieve uplift if they were ex-slaves, and he also links the civilized black people to once free black people and mulattoes. Oh, Jesus. I sounded like a fucking 1890 white woman. And mulattoes. I'm sorry, I was reading. And multiracial people. Ironically, where Frazier thought he was getting away from the eugenicist narrative, his tropes of being civilized and assimilated are foundational to the eugenicist narrative. Writing in 1939, Frazier cites no evidence of black uplift happening from people who were once slaves. So we already talked about how there's a dissertation in a book, so let's get into the dissertation. In a dissertation, he says without qualification that the release of the Negro from slavery saw people embarking on a journey towards greater civilization and eventual assimilation. But in line with Ezra Park assumptions, Frazier states that slavery stripped slaves of their African roots while making it difficult to impossible to learn and internalize a new culture. In the dissertation, he uses the terms culture, civilization, and assimilation as theorized by Park and other intellectual colleagues from the University of Chicago. Now, the book, Ollie on First Read, doesn't really look like the dissertation at all, but they're very much linked. The dissertation outlines problems, not fatal flaws of black people, and suggested possible change in the future. On the second and third reading of the book, going back and forth between the dissertation and the book, you'll notice Frazier weaponized black stories to make it appear that black people themselves believe that they were the ones establishing his frame, and that he is merely conveying their points of emphasis, which is very sneaky. Du Bois's 1908 study of the black family also makes heavy uses of quotes and passages. However, in Du Bois's sense, the effect was to humanize black people, while Frazier's analysis paints the picture of black people suffering from a unique form of poverty impervious to intervention. That is, the negative legacy of slavery, or what has come to be known as the deficit. That word is so fucking hard to say. The one exception is Frazier's heavy reliance on the historical writings of Ulrich Bonner Phillips, who took it as given that Africans were culturally backwards as well as biologically inferior, and he viewed slavery as an institution that partially but incompletely civilized Africans. His reference was the guy who thought that slavery civilized black people. That's a little weird. In fact, Ulrich Bonner Phillips applied this need for civilization trope more than anyone. Phillips was in many ways Du Bois's enemy. Du Bois wrote about slavery and Reconstruction looking from the bottom up, while Phillips looked at it from the vantage point of slave owners. Even though Frazier gives this point-counterpoint type thing, debunking eugenics in a way in the first pages of the dissertation, he doesn't do this for the parts of his rhetoric that, that have questionable logic. Instead, he constructs a narrative on the effects of slavery that presents Phillips as the last word on the subject. And since he ignored Du Bois's analysis that countered Phillips, Frazier's fatalism feels like the truth. In future writings, others would translate his fatalism into the concept of the black underclass. Moynihan captured that same fatalism in his now famous regurgitation of Frazier's prediction of the inevitable crumbling of the black family through internal faults, not societal forces such as social class. So whether he wanted to or not, Frazier basically helped people come to this false conclusion that there was something uniquely racial about black poverty. And he comes really close to suggesting that people of mixed race are automatically more civilized due to them being part white. In 1939, the same year this book was published, and Frazier believed in this theory that ex-slaves could not achieve uplift, UCLA had made room for some offspring of black sharecroppers that Frazier assumed couldn't be productive citizens, one being Jackie Robinson. And his classmate, Thomas Bradley, became the first black mayor of Texas. So, in Frazier's theory that ex-slaves could not socialize youth to become productive citizens, that's not a possibility. Frazier's perspective turned on high levels of black delinquency and pointed to this as evidence that black people weren't able to socialize their families. Working within the same period as Frazier in the same urban center from which Frazier drew his family data, Chicago, Michael W. Hummel studied the history of established segregated schooling in Chicago. In a section of his test covering family life, community, and schools, Hummel's analysis of school segregation, while not focused on black family dynamics per se, nevertheless presents a historical evidence that, when placed side by side with Frazier's works, provides a more plausible explanation for the rise in black youth delinquency than suggested by Frazier. Hummel found that overcrowding in white schools wasn't really as much of an issue as it was for black schools, as the white population had stabilized and actually begun to decline around 1940. This wasn't the case for black schools. Hummel found in 1941, although the school system was designed for about 18,000 students, it was actually servicing 28,000. So basically being at overcapacity of 35%. And a few elementary schools were operating at 30 to 40% overcapacity. The most dramatic overcrowding was at the high school level. DuSable High School had an official capacity of 2,400, but they were servicing 4,000 students. And these correlate with high neighborhood densities. Black areas of Chicago had 90,000 residents per square mile, while nearby white neighborhoods had 20,000 per square mile. The neighborhood overcrowding basically replicated in the schools. And part of the issue was the school board didn't want to build new schools, or didn't want to build them in black neighborhoods. Even with the white school population in decline, they were more likely to build a new school in a white neighborhood than a black one. So solution to this was the double shift policy. And basically this meant half the students would go at one part of the day and the other half would go at another part of the day. Black students were spending 20% to as high as 40% fewer hours in school than white students. The double shift policy meant that for the morning and afternoon shifts, nearly half the students enrolled at both high schools, 38,000 black students, were out of school and without supervision. So overcrowding in schooling and having half your students not able to go to school during normal hours because it's so overcrowded leads to much more truancy than a negative legacy of slavery, demonstrably. But Frazier just said, meh. Frazier never makes mention of a double shift policy in his analysis. Historical evidence strongly suggests that he should have known about double shifting. Double shifting was first documented in a report released in 1922 by the Chicago Commission on Race Relations titled The Negro in Chicago, for which Frazier's friend Charles S. Johnson did most of the writing. It reads, although there are no double schools in the group attended mainly by white Americans, one of the 6 attended by mainly Negroes, and 5 other schools attended mainly by children of immigrants are double schools. Years later, this double shift policy was looked at as a key finding igniting the 1919 Chicago race riots. In both his dissertation and his book, Frazier references the Chicago Urban League as a major supporter on his work of black families. So he knew. He fucking knew. So Frazier's analysis of black women was also very surface level. He assumed there was this unhinged sexual behavior because black people were being charged for like prostitution and vagrancy. Black women in particular. Black women could be charged for vagrancy for basically by word of mouth, and there was no proof needed. You could just say it and you're probably going to get charged for it if someone accuses you. So there's conjecture about the loose morals of black men and women were theorized from crime statistics. He theorized about the morals of black men and women from crime statistics. So while surely not Frazier's intent, his tropes of black people being uncivilized and unable to assimilate and being loose morally was pretty much the same rhetoric used in Birth of a Nation, the same rhetoric people use today to demonize black people. We're just gonna call it the DP. So the DP is basically a negative depiction of black people in general, but you can make the case that it mainly targets black men and boys. Perhaps the most comprehensive presentation of a deficit analysis, Joe L. Remsen accepts as good as science, past as well as contemporary research, showing that black boys and men are, in a few words, psychologically messed up. Remsen is not oblivious to the powers of social forces and oppression, but he presents arguments that the distorted and negative mindset of black males, quote-unquote, prevents them from recognizing and thus seizing opportunities right in front of them. Frazier implied that women-headed households were, by definition, broken. He theorized that slavery left the black family too dependent on women, and created a hierarchy of women over men. He tied a lot of issues of the black family to the feminization of the race. So what's really interesting is 10 to 15 years after the publication of the Moynihan report and Frazier's analysis, white families start to exhibit the same things that black families were, but oddly, no one said it was because they were white or because of their backward culture. The book titled Our Kids, The American Dream in Crisis, changing family dynamics for white people living in Port Clinton, Ohio, are shown to be the typical changes occurring among white families living throughout the United States. The book pointed out statistics about white families, skyrocketing rates of white juvenile delinquency, quintupling white single-parent households, increase in white unwed births from 20% to 40%, and an increase in white child poverty from 10% in 1999 to 40% in 2013. The consensus of this fall from grace of white families is said to be deindustrialization and globalization, terms that came about oddly when it happened to white families, but were never used, if ever used, when it was talking about black families. According to Barry Bluestone and Bennett Harrison, deindustrialization means a systemic disinvestment in the nation's basic productive capacity. Problems with the U.S. economy can be traced to the way capital and forms of financial resources has diverted from productive investment in our basic national industries into unproductive speculation, mergers and acquisitions, and foreign investment. Left behind are shuttered factories, displaced workers, and newly emerging ghost towns. This does not mean that the corporate managers are refusing to invest, but only that they're refusing to invest in the basic industries of the country. U.S. still has billions to spend, but instead of rebuilding steel capacity, it is paid $6 billion to acquire Marathon Oil of Ohio. General Electric is expanding its capital stock, but not in the United States. During the 1970s, GE expanded its worldwide payroll by 50,000, but it did so by adding 30,000 foreign jobs and reducing U.S. employment by 25,000. RCA Corporation followed the same strategy, cutting its U.S. employment by 14,000 and increasing its foreign workforce by 19,000. When failing plants become part of a corporate buyout, retirement and pension funds are often raided. The backstory for deindustrialization begins in the 1940s. During World War II, access to white male participation in the workforce dropped. This loss of manpower was replaced by the workforce participants who were once shunned by the industry, women and people of color. These urban center industries remained active through World War II, the Korean War, and to some extent the war in Vietnam. Manufacturing represented 53% of the American economy in 1965, but it fell to 39% in 1988 and 9% in 2004. This represents a loss of over 7 million jobs. The residents of the black ghettos in Chicago, Cleveland, Detroit, and Philadelphia responded to unemployment with a drop in marriage rates, an increase of out-of-wedlock births, an increase in drug addiction, street crimes, and gang behavior. Moynihan and others saw this as proof of Frazier's prophecy of black culture. Deindustrialization will not spread to the white communities for another 10 years, and residential segregation helps sustain the illusion that something other than socioeconomic forces were at play. Today, the destructive force of deindustrialization is easier to grasp because it is so evident in both communities. However, when confined to the black and Latino communities, "there must be something wrong with black folk" trope found easy access in the worldview of Moynihan, as did it with Frazier. I cannot stress how much Frazier was wrong about ex-slaves or people or descendants of ex-slaves not being able to become productive citizens. There was so much evidence that this was not the case. During the first 12 years of Reconstruction, black people were educating themselves at a pace to be more educated than the average white person. Funnily enough, this legacy of slavery Frazier points to was more evident in a white community than it was a black community. After the Civil War, greed, dominance, and thirst for privilege found everyday white Southerners practicing outrageous acts of inhumanity on black people. After a lynching, mothers and attendants would return home and feed their babies, children would go out to play, and men would return to their chores. This kind of human disconnect is referenced in psychology as sociopathy. The murder of Emmett Till and the Charlottesville March show that aspects of this legacy can be documented up to the present. In a study, they found that whites living in the areas of the South today in 1860 had high concentrations of slaves are more likely to identify as Republican, express colder feelings and resentment towards black people, and oppose affirmative action. When during the first 12 years of Reconstruction it became obvious that black people were advancing at a pace that would position them to be more educated than the average white person, black schools were shut down, and it would be 40 years before they would reappear. The African American experience in the Deep South from the end of Reconstruction was akin to living not within a democracy, but a cluster of southern states that presented a facade of democracy. In the 1930s, President Franklin D. Roosevelt could assemble the congressional majorities needed to adopt a New Deal legislation, but only by including Southern Democrats, who were fiercely committed to white supremacy. In consequence, Social Security and minimum wage protection, and the recognition of labor unions all excluded from the coverage of occupations which African Americans predominated: agriculture and domestic service. State and local governments followed suit. When, for example, in the mid-1930s, St. Louis constructed a segregated hospital for African American patients, a single black contractor was hired. White union members protested, and the city fired the contractor and announced it would no longer use any firm that employed African American labor. First National New Deal program, the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, adopted in 1933, disproportionately spent its funds on unemployed whites, and it frequently refused to permit African Americans to take any but the least skilled jobs. In 1935, President Roosevelt signed the National Labor Relations Act, granting unions at construction sites and factories the right to bargain with management if unions were supported by a majority of workers. Labor organizations that gained this official certification could negotiate contracts that covered all of employees. The original bill proposed by Senator Robert Wagner had prohibited government certification of unions that did not grant African American membership and workplace rights. But the American Federation of Labor lobbied to remove this clause. For at least the next 30 years, the government would protect the bargaining rights of unions that did not allow African Americans. As whites controlled resources and the instruments of power through political violence, two developmental patterns emerged. First, educational, commercial, and strategic resources were heaped on white citizens and white families, allowing them to experience accelerated advancement, that is, to achieve social mobility. Second, black Southern communities experienced accelerated marginalization and underemployment. The biggest example of these benefits being given to white people when they had issues but not black people would be the distribution of the World War II GI benefits. Certain senators made sure benefits were administered disproportionately to white GIs and created obstacles for black GIs, especially regarding benefits meant to create wealth. For example, in a 1947 survey of 13 Mississippi cities, only 2 of the 3,229 VA guaranteed loans were made to black GIs. The GI Bill of World War II was basically affirmative action for white people, if you will. Thus, while the World War II GI benefits practically made the growth of the white middle class possible in Mississippi, its racialized administration not so much blunted but suppressed and exaggerated the lack of growth in black middle class. This set the stage for the explosive growth of the black underclass in the 1960s and 70s. In the South, the GI Bill functioned in a manner deeply consistent with white supremacy and racial segregation across the board. In allowing states to administer the GI benefits, the federal government in effect joined in support of the South's war on black people. And let's not forget the black GIs who, when they returned home from the war fighting for this country, they were sometimes lynched for looking too proud. Even though the racism of the administration of GI benefits was made clear to them in 1947, nothing was done. Between 1934 and 1962, the Federal Housing and Veterans Administration distributed $120 billion in home loans, only 2% of which was awarded to black people and people of color. The VA not only denied African Americans the mortgage subsidies to which they were entitled, but frequently restricted education and training to lower-level jobs for African Americans who were qualified to acquire greater skills. In some cases, local benefit administrators refused to process applications to four-year colleges of African Americans, directing them to vocational schools instead. Going further, the government and corporation banks in the real estate industry made certain that 2% was for housing in less desirable areas, meaning these homes did not increase in value as the white homes. Collusion between federal agencies, banks, and the real estate industry helped limit black access to wealth through home ownership. Other forms of government-private conspiracies found ways to strip black families of farmland. Over 1 million black farmers had their farms taken from them through mechanizations orchestrated by local and federal farm agencies and Wall Street. So when it comes to what happened with the GI Bill benefits and the New Deal, the phrase white privilege is an understatement. So, in conclusion, DP is a negative portrayal of black people in general. Franklin Frazier legitimized it using the negative legacy of slavery trope, and this was completely false. And he inferred this from crime stats that were ripe with systemic racism, basically. The black delinquency he spoke of was mostly a result of school overcrowding. He also assumed that woman-headed households were, by definition, inferior, so misogynist. The Moynihan report basically used the same type of tactics Frazier did. Now people talk about the Moynihan report like it's evidence that black family is broken. The things that happened in the Moynihan report happened to white families like 10 to 15 years later. No one said shit. No one said white families were broken. No one said white culture was broken when this happened to the white people. And a lot of these ideas popularized by Frazier were brought into the modern day, and they are still harmful today. In conclusion, sometimes you think someone has good ideas, but they actually were peddling a eugenicist narrative, and maybe you should watch out for that. I don't know. Part 3.
So, you wanted to know about my experience of being or becoming consciously black as a black person, and specifically how my gender has impacted this, and it certainly has. But I remember, and I think this is probably true for most black people, I remember when I realized I was black, and it was in elementary school. I was standing in line, and this is the first time I can remember anyone ever using a racial slur for me. But I was standing in, in elementary school, we used to have single file lines or whatever, and this little white boy behind me pulled his pants down, around his butt or whatever, and said, "Look, I'm a nigger," and specifically saying it to me, and I might have been in 3rd or 4th grade at this point, if that, and I didn't sag my pants. To be honest with you, it's something I never really did, but it was such a fucking weird thing to say, and I had no conception of what was happening at the time. This is the first time it happened to me, and it wasn't until much later that I realized that he was just being fucking racist.
Let's begin with the story. Josiah Henson was a trusted slave who used to escort slaves for his owner. At one point during his journey when he escorted slaves, there was a part where he could let slaves go free if he wanted to, but he never did. Eventually, he moved to Canada and realized how this was fucked. But the moment he realized can be described as an epiphany. Let's take another story. The cycling champion Major Taylor used to toy around with skin bleaching products because he wanted to be seen as more acceptable. But one day he had an epiphany where he realized his skin was his fortune and he no longer wanted to use skin bleaching products and started to find pride in his blackness. The Harlem Renaissance and the New Negro movement of the 1920s were filled with messages of being woke, and the very phrase New Negro signals a rising consciousness. This aha moment, this sense of change, this 180 can be described as Nigrescence. In the aftermath of the murder of Martin Luther King, the change in black consciousness was recorded by 4 black psychologists in America. And while they all developed these models after King's death, despite not knowing each other, all these models kind of look the same, which may come across as being kind of cool, but that's actually not an uncommon thing. Nigrescence addresses the process of becoming quote-unquote woke. It can be described as a new awareness of racism or a more critical awareness of racism, and also a more critical awareness of your attachment to black culture and your black identity. It happens in stages, and I want to look at these stages and give examples from media and also maybe a personal story. We'll see. So it starts in the pre-encounter stage. The pre-encounter stage is basically being unwoke. The pre-encounter stage is also driven mainly by colorblind racial ideology, and this is captured by two camps: color evasion and power evasion. Color evasion is the belief that race does not matter in daily experiences, and people with this view often don't look at themselves in racial terms. Power evasion, on the other hand, is a belief that racism does not matter. These people argue that we live in a democratic society and that anyone who works hard can achieve success in America despite racism. These individuals have minimal awareness of racial disparities in the society, and if they see disparities, they blame the individuals or cultural practices for them. Thus, people primarily operating from a pre-encounter miseducated and self-hatred frame endorse a power evasion logic. Colorblind racial ideology, therefore, is an information processing strategy people with high levels of pre-encounter beliefs use to interpret the world around them and to deny the very existence of racism. It can be described as three different subscales as well. You can be an assimilationist, a miseducationist, or a self-hatred type. I actually think self-hatred is way less common than people think, and self-hatred is thrown around more often when it's actually miseducation of what we're speaking about. What I mean here is Bill Clinton passed a lot of bills that were mainly targeting black men, yet a lot of these bills and anti-fucking crime bills were supported by black people. Despite these bills mostly being supported and, gaining most of their traction through stereotypes and racism, these black people, a lot of them still voted for it because even though they were, peddling these stereotypes about black men, they didn't see these as views of them. They were more like detached from it. Instead of focusing on a root causes like a rational person who actually wants to solve the problem, the media and government officials began to attack the psychological integrity of black men and pass crime prevention legislation that eventually led to the school-to-prison pipeline. At both the state and federal level, black people supported such governmental and police actions in part because black public opinion stood in agreement with the stereotypes anchoring such actions. Miseducation was evidence for black people who otherwise viewed their own personal identity as positive, as the stereotypes were compartmentalized and did not apply to them personally. Miseducation and self-hatred can seem like the same thing, but they're actually two very distinct concepts. It's weird. It's kind of like you disconnect yourself from the negative view of blackness you have. In the show Bel Air on Peacock, there's a character named Carlton. In the first episode of Bel Air, Carlton is automatic problematic. He's letting his white friend single on the hot nigga. He also made a comment in passing that just because he speaks well, that black people don't think he's black, which is just a classic fucking Carlton line. Carlton's mindset exhibits pre-encounter very well, and what I like about Carlton in Bel Air is his character also demonstrates the next stage of Nigrescence, which is encounter. The encounter can be described in a historical sense as the moment that King died, where something happens and triggers your awakening. I would understand this moment in Bel Air for Carlton to be when he was playing lacrosse. Sorry, spoilers for Bel Air, but not that big of a spoiler. Carlton was playing lacrosse and he heard his white friend make a joke about black people not being able to take lacrosse from them. And suddenly Carlton realizes that, wait a minute, this guy actually is a little bit of a racist. That was a moment that inspired the need for change. In general, the encounter stage can be described as the aha moment or the moment triggering the need for change, when the old self and the new self are juxtaposed and the flaws of the old self are becoming like flashing billboards while the new self is becoming more dominant, captivating, and compelling and addictive. The need for change is unquestioned. The next stage is the emergent stage. This is a stage where you're still trying to figure things out. You're starting to realize that you didn't have things figured out before, and now you're trying to figure out what is the correct way to go about things. And the old identity is slowly dying while a new identity is slowly growing and taking strength. A lot of times people will demonstrate this new identity with extreme acts to assert the new identity. When a person is going through this stage, the new identity is glorified and put on a pedestal. As a positive motivating force, this stage lets people feel they cannot consume enough information and history about their group. As a negative force, it promotes simple-minded black and white categorical either-or forms of thinking. There's also a very palpable sense of rage linked to these early developments of the Nigrescence model because they were more male-centered. And this sense of rage with this encounter and also the second stage can be linked to likely because these models were developed at a time when black men were the victims of a lot of racial violence. So the rage coming with the awakening was probably the vibes for a lot of black men at the time. In Bel Air, I think this third stage can be understood in Carlton to where in the lacrosse practice, he broke his friend's hand, which was kind of funny, kind of cool. kind of awesome, not gonna lie. And this, I feel like, can be sort of understood as the internalization stage, where Carlton makes a stand and makes, the statement that he no longer wants to fuck around with him because he's being a racist asshole. But also, there's a scene where Carlton talks with another black student and they kind of call him to question his blackness, or his relationship to his blackness, because they never really see him around like any black events at school. I think Carlton would technically be still stuck in the emergent stage, so I don't know. Season 4, I'm expecting it to be more of a focus on Carlton developing and trying to become black. I think that's going to be so interesting. I don't know. I think that's where the season's going to go, but I don't know if it's going to go that way. Cross thinks this stage was present in the African psychologists who, despite, being quote unquote woke, were still kind of peddling eugenicist narratives about white people. He speaks about this conference or thing he went to where there's this board where they inserted a white person, even though there were no white people there, to differentiate themselves from white people. And there was also one speaker who didn't want to identify as human to avoid being identified with white people. Cross states in the stage, you run a risk of becoming very pro-black and very self-centered in your blackness, to where it's more unproductive than productive. This stage also can be frustrating for a lot of people because they don't really know what else to learn, and at this stage you're probably fucking trying to learn as much as you can, and you can't learn enough. But then you get to the 4th/5th stage, which is internalization. This is where you were internalizing your new identity and you were not looking back. Now you were solidified in your blackness, but in the 4th stage, Cross also states that this can include being transcendental and being multi-inclusive of your blackness. So you're not only looking at black issues, you're also looking at queer issues, you're also looking at immigrant issues, you're also looking at things outside of your blackness and things that include identities that aren't including yours. Maybe your awakening of your blackness also comes with your awakening of your sexuality, or your awakening of your gender, or your awakening of how your gender and sexuality play into your general life. It's a very transcendental stage, and I think and this stage was mostly added because a lot of feminists took issue with the very male-centered view of Nigrescence. The 4th stage is where you're no longer feeling insecure about your blackness, and feelings of not being black enough are no longer there. I thought discussing Nigrescence would be interesting because I've heard about the doll study so much, and I've never really heard anyone develop a model of black identity that described personally what I feel like my process was so well. The doll test didn't account for the next stage of a black child's life, where they develop a critical consciousness and, maybe become more awakened or no longer feel insecurity towards their blackness, which again, it cannot be insecurity. It could also be biculturalism. Nigrescence also addresses the black people who, even during slavery, were becoming woke. The eruption of black consciousness has been a constant in black America, and I think a lot of the rhetoric around black identity kind of discounts that. Being woke has now basically become an insult. Another thing that Nigrescence addresses is that black people, even during slavery, were still able to develop, a critical consciousness and still able to develop a humanity and able to walk out of slavery with assets. When people look at slavery as though it cursed black people, basically, it kind of discounts that even though you were in an inhumane system, black people were still developing, child socialization practices and still raising very, productive citizens, still raising very stable, productive people despite this shitty system. And I think the reason this doesn't get talked about a lot is because it can come off as though you're defending slavery, but that's not what it is. Simply addressing that slavery, while being an evil system, did not break black people, which is what a lot of people imply with their tropes nowadays. But once you develop this critical consciousness, there are a few things you can do to keep it going and make sure, you don't fall back prey to miseducation. You can develop a racial literacy. Basically, this is developing a understanding of history that isn't dominated by the United States public school system. The more you develop this racial literacy and more of a critical eye for identifying racial flaws and, colorblind views, the less susceptible you are to colorblind ideology. And it also increases the likelihood of you taking critical action, which is exactly what it sounds like, making work to end systemic racism, making work to make your community better with this new awareness of racism and awareness to your blackness. Basically, racial literacy promotes critical reflection and increased capacity for critical action. And there are a number of ways this can be encouraged by educators and parents. For example, educators and parents can incorporate lessons to foster critical engagement of messages you perceive about race through popular media and society. They can identify current or local national racial disparity and invite youth and young adults to discuss questions like who benefits and in what ways from the disparity, who loses out and in what ways from the disparity, things like that. Viewing news stories about social issues involving race, educators and parents can encourage youth to identify what positions are silent or not present in the stories. The goal is to have youth and young adults internalize a critical lens that will guide independent identification of the disparities, the impact of the disparities, and also the root causes of the disparities. Through these exercises, individuals will begin to see the way race and racism operate in society. This lens isn't intended to constrict a person's analytic approach to just race, but instead, the lens should provide the person with new ways of thinking about the world around them and the importance in remaining open to multiple perspectives which may be silenced in the discourse. You can also engage in race talk. This is basically developing a space and community where Black people can speak about racism without judgment. Also, uncover and celebrate positive achievements. There is some empirical evidence providing support for the influence of increased positive, sane racial ethnic interactions and encounters among Black people. For example, students who attend historically Black colleges tend to have more racial pride and better self-image than their Black American counterparts who attend predominantly white institutions. While I think this model is very interesting and it applied to me very well, there are still some issues. It was very male-centered, and the aha moment, or the second stage, the encounter stage, was understood originally to be a very male-centered anger moment. This isn't what Nigrescence looks like for a lot of people who aren't Black men. And also another thing is it's very hard to define Black identity, even if you have a PhD. But the evidence still stands that Black people with a critical consciousness and awareness of racism and attachment to their culture are typically better mentally than Black people who don't have this. This is why I use the more inclusive model of the four. Eventually, they developed a cross-racial identity scale, which I think is the most accurate and updated version of how race plays into the psychological aspect of people's lives, but cross-racial identity scale also incorporates Nigrescence. Anyway, that is Nigrescence, and that is becoming woke. I guess we can end this with my story becoming woke, since we're here. Growing up, I wasn't really taught about the nuances of race, sexuality, and gender. Racism was never really a concern because I was mostly surrounded by Black people, and I never really learned about racism unless it was in school, and even then I use the term learn very, very lightly. Growing up, honestly, I was more concerned with being gay because that was the most prominent issue for me. I remember around elementary school, I learned what gay was, and then, sort of learned what gay was. More on that later. And then realizing that that could be me, but I assumed it would just go away. It did not. I also remember rationalizing to myself by being like, obviously I am a woman or a girl in a boy's body because only girls like boys, so clearly I'm a girl, right? No, but that was my rationalization of it at the time because that was better than being gay. My interpretation of being gay was the gay that my family and church condemned, this often being the visible gay, the man who is feminine and likes men. As I grew up, I associated femininity with being gay, like most boys my age, and if I wasn't feminine, then obviously I wasn't gay. It was a very complex denial. I recall as a child, I was told not to hold my wrist a certain way, you know the way, and also being told not to pull my head back in shock, you know the head motion, because it was a gay motion. I was literally sat down by my family so they could explain to me that I need to stop being as gay or as feminine. I was also forced into sports, which I hated, but eventually after they realized I wasn't going to be the athlete child they wanted, they gave up on their dream. With all of this, my feminine traits became less prominent, and I became a proper boy, not doing all that gay shit. And these conversations died down, but I still had an issue. I was still gay, despite the several sermons at church and so many nights praying to God to not make me gay. It was still very much there. And this eventually led me further and further away from religion. I wasn't an atheist, but I was starting to feel as though the church wasn't for me. The fear of hell having sent me to an existential crisis at the ripe age of 11 had kind of ruined the vibes of the church for me. Homophobia was the oppression most visible to me at the most earliest ages of my life, and by the time I got to college in my freshman year, I was very deep into atheist YouTube, and you probably know where this story is going. Being on this side of YouTube, I became a fan of a lot of creators who helped me get over my fear of hell and feel more secure in my departure from religion, which helped in some ways, but I was also getting recommended SJW takedowns around the time I started college. I was a fan of Sam Harris's lectures on religion, but Sam Harris started to become more and more adjacent to the right, and with that happening, and me having little to no political frame, I got a peek into what people call the alt-right pipeline. I didn't fall down the pipeline like others. I watched a bit of early Steven Crowder's Change My Minds, but also at that time I was a criminal justice major, and the things Crowder was saying about black crime statistics were the opposite of what I was hearing in class. So, you would think this would be around the time I hit Encounter, but while I did learn about these disparities and arrests, my idea of racism was still very much focused on the overt and extreme. But then I remember seeing some clips of BLM chanting, "Pigs in a blanket, fry them like bacon," and being like, well, that's not good. And at this point, I was working from a reference of understanding civil rights to be very turn the other cheek. I had heard a few stories of police brutality, but I was still working from a very much bad apple perspective. But then around I think it was late 2018, a bit before I started this channel, I saw the Netflix documentary, The 13th, and I'm not sure why I ended up watching it, but watching it was one of the few moments in my life, and I'm not, a very angry person at all, but this is one of the few moments in my life where I can point to a sense of actual, very strong sense of just rage. I want to say this was a turning point. Learning about Khalif Browder, Rodney King, Sandra Bland, and a lot of others were all moments of anger, and learning by COINTELPRO was more anger, and then I eventually realized this anger was coming from a realization that not only had I been lied to, but I believed the lie, that this nation had issues, but we were just. Now, while I can put a lot of this onto my education pre-college, something else happened around this time, which I think would be my quote-unquote encounter. I think it was around the time the BLM protests were going on, and I was with my mom on a phone, and we were just chatting, and I remember her criticizing the protest basically and being like, if people just, didn't resist the cops, that everything will be fine. And I was just like, what? Now, this moment caught me off guard, but a little bit after, I started to look back at my childhood and be like, maybe there was more going on than just my education at school. I remember growing up, whenever we watched the local news, there was always, a black man being accused of something, being arrested for something, always a mugshot of us. And I never really thought of it that much, but my mom would always comment upon it, and it was never a positive comment, never a sympathetic comment. It was always just niggas being niggas. And I think I kind of internalized that over time to try to not be what my mom saw as negative. And it was a lot of try to be good in school, don't get into trouble, don't get into the streets, don't cry, don't be a man, all that. And I think trying to live up to this standard of trying to not be what I think my mom disliked the most, or disliked very much, was pushing me towards this colorblind ideology, which I thought was the right way towards being, successful, was the right way of looking at things. And when I heard her make that comment about the BLM protests, I was just like, holy fuck. I would have said that shit probably 2-3 years ago. And I know now that rhetoric comes from fucking racists. My relationships towards my family and others started to change, and I was starting to become more comfortable in my femininity and less comfortable with the standard of being a man, to the point I feel less and less attached to it as time goes on. I don't want to claim I'm in an internalization stage because it seems cocky, but the description of seeing the old self and comparing the new self to the old self and the new self becoming more dominant really hit home for me. If you'd have told me fucking 5 years ago that I'd be painting my nails and wearing roses in my hair, I would have burst into fucking flames. Anyway, To conclude, you can't really define Black identity because Black identity is kind of socially constructed, and also there is no correct way to be Black. But yeah, that is Nigrescence, and after going through the 4 stages, you become woke, and then you are now a woke scold or a SJW or whatever. Woke has kind of become an insult, but never mind that. I don't know, I thought this was a very interesting concept, and I thought you guys would enjoy talking about it. That is how you become woke. That is Nigrescence, and that is my brief history on Black identity. I don't care that brief doesn't equal over an hour. It is brief to me. I really hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope maybe this video triggered your awakening. Let me know how you feel about it in the comments, and until next time, guys.
Learning about as I get older consistently. Like I've never, like there's no situation I think where I stop and go, I learned everything there is to know about this.